Shabbat Shalom. So this morning's Torah portion, we read from towards the end of this morning's Torah portion, but I have to say it's not the easiest Torah portion in the Torah to talk about. A couple of weeks ago, we had a portion in which it gave us the code of how to be holy, how to live as a holy people. And yet, at the beginning of this week's Torah portion, we have a whole other set of rules about being holy, but directed at a particular class of Israelites, directed specifically at the priests, the Kohanim. And when we, from this distance in time and space, look at those rules, first of all, we notice that they're demanding, and secondly, we might find them a little bit distasteful. So, for example, there's the rule that many of my colleagues have written about this week that says that a priest serving in the temple has to be physically perfect. Any kind of physical imperfection, anything that we today might come under the rubric of disability, is going to disqualify somebody from serving as a priest. And that's challenging. It's difficult. There are restrictions on who a priest, a Kohen, can marry. There are restrictions on to what extent a priest can be in contact with the dead, something that vestiges of that still apply today. You may have noticed that when you go to a Jewish graveyard, or at least the Jewish graveyards from where I come from in England, there are special paths that are marked for Kohanim, for the priests, so that they do not come into close contact with the dead. And it's difficult and it's obscure, this language, this Levitical language of purity and impurity. And the challenge, of course, is how do we make that relevant for ourselves in the lives that we live today? And today I want to offer one approach. It's not the only approach that we can have to these rules, but because, as I mentioned before, this Shabbat is Fair Trade Shabbat, I want to see whether the approach that I'm offering can embrace those principles and come out with something coherent about what this very old set of rules can offer us today. And I want to begin with the proposition that was offered to the Jewish people at Sinai. When, as it were, just before the giving of the Ten Commandments at Revelation, God goes down on one knee and proposes a permanent arrangement between God and the people. The offer is that the people should be Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh, that we should be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So for the purposes of this argument here this morning, I want to offer the idea that while there is a caste or a class of people who are Kohanim, who are priests, the underlying idea is that all of us are priestly, that every single Israelite is holy. And you may have come across the very famous parable by Ansky, the Yiddish playwright, that says, for the purposes of Yom Kippur, that every one of us is a priest, that every day is Yom Kippur, and that every place we stand is a temple. There are similar arguments that are put forward in the Talmud after the destruction of the temple that say that the Jewish home is the replacement of the temple, a mikdash me'at, they call it, a little sanctuary. So if we can dig down underneath the language of purity and impurity and prescription and proscription, what we find coming forth, if we allow the idea that all of us, in a way, are priests, then we can take on the idea that we can elevate our lives by the way that we practice. We can elevate our lives. We can live a more holy existence. And so for today, I want to take one very common aspect of our lives, and I want to see if it is possible to elevate it, if it is possible to notice it, if it is possible to think about it in a way that is more holy and makes us more holy, and, if I can manage it, to also link it to Fair Trade Shabbat. So here's what I'm going to suggest. I'm going to suggest that we look at something that we do so frequently that we might not even notice that we do it. Something that we practice more than once a day. Something that is a required practice in order for us to be able to stay alive. And I want to see what the possibilities are for elevating that practice and for making it something that is more conscious. I'm talking about eating. I'm talking about the way that we eat, the way that we approach whatever it is that we put inside our bodies. Is it possible for eating for us to be a holy practice? Judaism has within it the possibility of making our eating something that is both more conscious and more holy. And it's set out in the book of Deuteronomy in 3 steps. 3 steps that are familiar to us because we quote them in the Grace After Meals that is sung at camp and that is sung whenever we sit down to eat a meal that has had bread in it. The words are, ve'achalta, you shall eat. How do they go on? V'savata, you shall be satisfied, and uverachta, and you shall bless. Ve'achalta, you shall eat. V'savata, you shall be satisfied. Uverachta, and you shall bless. Can we use that very ancient set of commandments to elevate the way that we eat? I'm going to take them one by one, and I'm going to argue that we can. Ve'achalta, first of all, then, you shall eat. The act of eating is specifically named, and by eating, we don't mean grabbing, and we don't mean snacking. Does anybody know the modern Hebrew word for a snack? Anybody? It's called a chatif. And it comes from lachtof. It comes from the Hebrew verb that means to grab. So a snack is something that you grab. But that's not what this commandment is. Ve'achalta. We eat, we consume, we digest. There's a Kabbalistic teaching that says that what we do when we eat is that we release the divine sparks of energy that are contained in the food so that we can release them into the world and use them to serve God. And in one sense, we can think about this as being about the choices that we make about what we eat. When we choose the healthy and the nutritious over the unhealthy and the nutrient empty, then we can honor the body that God made. We can feed and we can uphold the structure of what God has given us in order to be able to function and serve in the world. And in that way, in consciously choosing what we eat, we can honor God's image. But there's also a wider, if you want, a more worldly aspect of eating better, and that, I think, is where the fair trade piece can come in. As many of you know, hands up, just show me if you've encountered the expression fair trade before. Okay, so many of you have. It is a worldwide movement. It began in the 1940s, and the aim of the movement is to relieve poverty. And the idea is that food manufacturers work with food producers to set a minimum price for their goods that is a realistic price for the goods that they have on offer. And the aim is to help alleviate poverty in farming communities around the world. And we have to acknowledge that fair trade is not a perfect system. It's not a perfect system because the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, the urge, the selfish urge to expand, is still very highly active in the production chains for coffee and for vanilla and for rubber and even for diamonds, all of which, by the way, you can obtain with a fair trade certification. Chocolate is another one of those foods. There's always going to be people in those chains who want to make a quick buck at somebody else's expense. But fair trade and taking care to buy products that have a fair trade certification is an attempt on our part to remind ourselves that we who consume and the people who produce are actually in a relationship. And for that relationship to have meaning, it needs to be conducted with some semblance of morality. making a resolution that we are going to buy and consume fair trade over non-fair trade is one way of conducting that relationship. And if it is the case, and according to the Talmud it is, that our home is a mikdash me'at, it's a small sanctuary, and the table is the altar in that sanctuary, then it behooves us to be mindful about what we're going to bring there. So by way of an example, sometime before Pesach this year, the LA Times ran an article about the appalling conditions in which Mexican workers who are picking tomatoes and zucchini and peppers, asparagus, among other vegetables. This article exposed the conditions in which those workers were kept. And one of our congregants took the decision that produce that came from those sources should not have a place on her Seder table. Because the irony of consuming that produce at a time when we ourselves were remembering being enslaved, that was too strong an irony to be able to sustain. And so she kept that produce off her Seder table. Another example of how we can make conscious choices about ve'achalta, that we can eat more mindfully, that we can elevate the very common practice of our eating. It's so mundane, apparently, but by choosing what we eat, we can affirm our connection not just with our own bodies, but also with the wider world, and we can put on record our wish that that connection should be a fair one. Ve'achalta, we shall eat. Ve'savata, the second step, we shall be satisfied. And I want to point out, first of all, that we could go straight from ve'achalta, we shall eat, uverachta, and we shall bless. There isn't any particular necessity for us to be satisfied. And that's what makes this step so intriguing and so mysterious. I think that it is often the case that we eat mindlessly and that we eat without being satisfied. I think the core of Visavata is to notice that we are full and our bowl is empty. And it looks so obvious, but the idea of being full, the idea of having an empty bowl to look into, is not the case still for a very large percentage of the world. I did a quick Google. There are many other places to Google. 805 million people, 805 million of the 7.3 billion people in the world, that's 1 person in 9, go hungry. They suffer from chronic undernourishment. If we narrow the focus and we just take America, there are 49.1 million Americans who are living in a state of food insecurity. That's 33.8 million adults and 15.8 million children. 33.3 million adults in this country here today now, and 15.8 million children are not satisfied, do not get to look at an empty bowl. And that image of the empty bowl is a poignant one. Time out. There is a program here in Los Angeles that is called Empty Bowl, and I want to mention it. It's a program that is run by Family Promise. It's going to take place on Sunday, June the 14th at St. Finbar Church in Burbank. And it's such a simple and beautiful premise. Independent potters, arts associations, and other groups within the community create ceramic bowls. The people who come to the Empty Bowl initiative pay for that bowl to be filled with soup, and there's also bread and dessert that is donated by restaurants in the area. And then you take your bowl home as a reminder and a symbol of the uncertainty that is faced by homeless families. The empty bowl that is full. Vesavata. Next time we eat, we might want to notice our empty bowl, And we might also want to put June the 14th on our calendars after Shabbat when we get home. Ve'achalta, we can eat mindfully. Ve'savata, we can be satisfied mindfully. Uverachta, and we can bless. The rabbis built this one out. In the Bible it says that you bless after, but we know that we bless before and after, so those 3 steps become 4. We begin with blessing. And Judaism contains numerous brachot. You will know, I think, the bracha for wine, the bracha for bread. Ali is going to say both of those at the end of the service. We know brachot for fruit. We know them for vegetables. But there are other brachot that I believe deserve to be rehabilitated into our daily practice. There's a special bracha for fruit that smells good. So next time you have a guava, it's a good bracha on a guava. There's special brachot for herbs. In England we say herbs. I know you say herbs. I refuse to accept it. There's special brachot, boreis ve'besamim, grasses that smell good. And, my favorite, there is a special bracha for the second portion of anything. The second glass of wine, the second piece of cheesecake has its own special bracha, hatov v'hametiv, who is good and who does good. And the idea of these brachot is that we don't just mindlessly take from the world, that before we eat, before the food reaches our mouths, we stop that trajectory and we notice that we're eating, that the food comes from somewhere, as we've said, that the food is going to turn into us so that we can serve the world better, and that having food is never a given. So we might consider, before the next thing we eat, making a blessing. We might even consider making up our own. We might consider preparing our soul for the nourishment that lies ahead. And after we eat, we bless again, with the same gratitude and the same focus. Many of us know the long-sung grace after meals, complete with the gestures and the hand movements that you learn at camp. It's less well known that there is a closing blessing for anything that we eat, even if it's a piece of chocolate. Long and medium-sized and small brachot. So we bookend our food. Ve'achalta, ve'savata, uverachta, that we should eat, that we should be satisfied, that we should bless, and that we should do all of these 3 things consciously. And I invite us on this Shabbat, when we learn about priests and their special duties, I invite us to try it. I invite us to elevate the everyday acts of our lives into something that is a little more meaningful and a little more connecting us to God, connecting us to the world around us. Because the more we infuse our lives with such awareness, the more meaningful our lives become. And if we can do that, then maybe one day we can hope to fulfill the promise that was made to us at Sinai, that we should be Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh, that we should be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.